Welcome to WPPM Podcast, Wind Power Project Management Master's Program at Uppsala University Campus Gotland. And we have Geoffrey De Sena today, and I'm super excited. I personally learned a lot from you, Geoffrey. You are a graduate of the WPPM program with industry experience in onshore and offshore O&M development, and you have experience in 3 continents. And what was it? According to your LinkedIn, you are a sustainability nerd. So can you give us a bit more on your background and what are you working on these days?
Okay. Yes, I did the program now 6 years ago, so 2016, 2017, and I believe that was the year before they started offering a 2-year program. So it was only a 1-year program. I spent about 6 months here in Visby and then went to Tønsberg, Norway to work with WindSim to write my thesis on turbulence modeling over forests, which is a lot to do in a very short time. So it was quite an adventure. I hung around in Europe for a little bit after that, and then decided that I needed to move back to the U.S. to save America from Republicans. But it was a crazy mission, and I decided that I didn't even like living in the U.S. all that much anyway. So I did end up working for a developer called Invenergy. They're a developer and an owner and operator, but I was on the development side. I mostly focused on central United States, primarily in Kansas, working on greenfield development of wind farms and a little bit in solar and storage as well. But in 2018, decided I wanted to come back to Europe, and I got an opportunity through some of my classmates to move to Belgium to work with a company called Parkwind. I believe they now own 4 or 5 offshore wind farms in Belgium and Germany, but at the time they had 3 offshore wind farms in the Belgian waters. And I was an asset manager for one of those wind farms and did a lot of data analysis of the SCADA data coming off the turbines and looking for performance trends and such, which was fascinating. But less than a year into my tenure there, I was contacted by Stefan Ivanel, the professor here in the wind energy section, and he asked me to come back to fill in as an adjunct as we needed help here in running many of the online courses. And so I was happy to return to Visby, even though I only did for about 6 months before COVID took off, and I returned to the US to be with my partner. And I just got back to Visby in November of 2022. So it's been just about 6 months now of teaching a little bit on campus, but mostly doing the online courses, wind power basics, energy and environment, and those kinds of things.
Okay, nice. Thank you. Let us introduce the topic first. The U.S. wind industry. Do you have a better title for it?
I should probably come up with a better title just to restrict myself a little bit. I have a tendency to wander, but
Okay.
I think we'll stick with that and just try to keep things not too deep.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. So, floor is yours.
All right. So the U.S. wind industry is in a really interesting point in its history right now, because the regulatory environment that we are heading into and some of the new developments and especially the support schemes for wind energy in the U.S. changed radically last year with the Inflation Reduction Act. So I want to try to paint a picture a little bit of how we got to where we are, but with the understanding that a lot of that is going to change going forward. The wind energy industry in the U.S. started much like many places in Europe, with the oil crises in the 1970s really showing us that we can't just consider fossil fuels as infinite and waste them frivolously, that we actually have to pay attention. So some legislation in the late 1970s made some significant changes to the U.S. energy market that supported diversifying the energy supply and also allowing some of the smaller energy producers to actually get onto the grid. And that definitely benefited wind energy, which is now primarily produced by independent power producers. Utilities own some of their own assets, but it's mostly wind energy companies, renewable energy companies, just energy companies that develop and own and operate wind farms in the U.S. And that's the product of how it all began in the 1970s. But there was a very short-lived wind boom in the early 1980s with some of the early subsidies supporting wind. But the 1980s was also the age of Reaganomics and trying to cut the federal budget as much as possible, and subsidies for energy, especially wind energy and solar and other renewables, was one of the first things to go. So the wind industry kind of went underground for about 10 years until the introduction of the production tax credit in 1992, which was a per megawatt hour subsidy. I think it was about $23 per megawatt hour as a tax credit, which makes the system a little bit complicated, but effectively wind energy generators could collect a production subsidy for producing renewable energy. And that was set to expire in 1999. And that began this boom and bust cycle of wind energy development that in 1999, developers rushed to empty their pipelines to capture that tax credit, and then there's hardly any development in 2000. But then the tax credit gets extended to 2001, and they rush to empty the pipeline, and then there's nothing in 2002, and then extended to 2003 and 2009 and 2012, and we see this boom and bust as the industry gets its feet under it, and each boom cycle is bigger than the last, until 2015, when there was an agreement that, okay, this is it for real this time. No more production tax credit. We're going to step down over the next 4 years. If you start your project by 2016, you can capture that credit as long as you build within the next 4 years. And that last little tidbit is super important, because the wind development in 2020 during the height of the pandemic was the best year ever for wind energy development, hitting about 17 gigawatts of new wind installed. It has not been to that level since, mostly because of supply chain issues, global energy issues, but a lot of things also changed in that the production tax credit was extended, and then extended again. And now with the Inflation Reduction Act, the production tax credit has been extended through 2024, and then will be replaced with a clean energy tax credit, which will give any electricity generator who can produce electricity without carbon emissions. So that could be wind energy, or it could be a coal-fired power plant with carbon capture and storage. If you can produce electricity carbon-free, then you can qualify for these tax credits, which are either production-based or investment-based. Depends on which technology and which field of development is going to be most suitable. Decides which one you're going to choose. So the boom and bust cycle is hopefully over, and hopefully we can see steady days of steady growth into the future. But only time will tell. This legislation is set to continue until the U.S. has reduced its electricity-related emissions to less than 25% of what it was last year in 2022. And if they hit that before 2034, then the subsidies go away in 2034. But if they don't hit that, then as the law stands now, those subsidies are basically indefinite. So that's kind of the big thing, and that gets us up basically to today.
Okay. So in your eyes, right now, what is the biggest challenge for wind industry in US? Policies, politics, economy?
Yeah. So I am sure that there are some short-term things that have really shaken up the industry in the last couple years. in 2021, they were on track, or at least they were planning to have an even better year than 2020. But with supply chain issues, loads of projects got pushed off into 2022. So yeah, I think supply chain issues are a big factor, and all the things that come with supply chain issues and energy disruptions, challenges with manufacturing, challenges with finding labor. I mean, it is common throughout the U.S. economy that employers cannot find the talent that they need, and the wind industry is no different. The Department of Energy is predicting massive shortfalls in turbine technicians and manufacturing and everything, just not keeping up with the demand. But probably the biggest long-term challenge for the U.S. is transmission. That the U.S. electricity grid was just not designed to bring electricity from way out in the middle of windy nowhere into the population centers. So we've entered a world where wind energy developers are actually building their own high voltage transmission lines for long distances. And there are several projects across the U.S. to move electricity in different places. There's a big project to move electricity from Wyoming out to like Las Vegas in Southern California, or connecting Montana with the Northwest, or sending wind energy from Kansas out to Indiana and Indianapolis area. Those projects have been in development for years and years and years. And like the one from Kansas, like everyone thought it was dead, and then it started getting revived, and then I think my old employer, Invenergy, actually acquired it and like now has their own transmission department. So yeah, the private sector is kind of taking this on, but moving forward, especially with the Inflation Reduction Act and the big infrastructure bill of 2021. The federal government is throwing a lot of money at this problem. We're talking billions of dollars are going towards understanding and expanding the transmission in the U.S., which will probably help, but it's a long, slow process. Building transmission is a thankless task.
Yeah. Okay. Let me just ask some questions that I've received from students now. What are the differences between the European and American wind power markets?
Yeah, in the markets, I can really only speak from my experience in development in the U.S. And I kind of like to use the analogy of like the U.S. kind of feels like the Wild West a little bit. That there's just not a lot of guidance and regulation for onshore development. Offshore is a whole different world. Maybe we'll talk about that. But at least onshore, most regulations around wind energy are decided at the county level. So that means that they can be widely different from county to county in the same state, which is a challenge for developers. It can also be an opportunity because some of those regulations are very favorable. That like they just don't exist. So
Okay.
a wind developer can kind of just walk in and do whatever they want, which also presents its own risk. That there have been many cases where developers have been a bit sloppy and have angered some of the people in the area, and the county responds by placing a moratorium on wind development. There are counties in Ohio that have just placed a ban on wind and solar development just until further notice. You are not building wind and solar, at least at the utility scale. So there's risk. There's just more risk that the government's not going to be holding your hand through it. There are tools out there that developers can use, but for the most part, like governments can support wind energy through like renewable portfolio standards, in which they require utilities to get a certain amount of their electricity from renewables. But in terms of actually going out, finding sites, and developing the project, that's really on the developer. So I would say there's definitely more risk in the market, but there are also a lot of lower costs and other opportunities, and permitting is usually quicker. once you get all of the pieces together, and often the limiting factors are things like getting access to transmission or finding an off-taker.
Okay. How has the growth of wind industry in the United States impacted global markets, particularly in Europe?
Yeah, so it seems that the U.S. market has kind of been not necessarily insular, but it certainly hasn't been taking a leading role. Like I think I mentioned that the U.S. wind industry is the second largest in the world, just going by capacity, only second to China. But that is purely a product of the U.S. just being enormous. And so, like, much of what the U.S. wind industry has done, they've really learned from Europe. So, like, the U.S. only has one homegrown turbine manufacturer, General Electric. They do have a global presence. They do have a presence here in Europe, but I think the last time I checked, they only had something like 4 or 5% of the market here in Europe. They're a small player, and I think they're a small player in many other places. Maybe a little bit bigger in the Americas, but especially when you start looking at Africa and Asia, like if you need low cost, you're probably going with a Chinese manufacturer. If you need really high quality, you're going with a European manufacturer. So I actually don't know how much influence the U.S. market has had up to this point on other markets, but I would definitely say going forward, I think that's going to change as the industry continues to develop, especially the offshore industry. And I think there are some opportunities. And one interesting opportunity I see is installing offshore wind farms, that because of the Jones Act that requires all goods moved between U.S. ports to be carried by American-made, American-registered, American-crewed, American-owned vessels, that they are now building specific wind energy installation vessels in the U.S., which is kind of even new in Europe. And so that kind of expertise could, in the future, be exported. So I think the U.S. has an opportunity to really have an influence on other markets, but up to this point, I can't point to anything. That doesn't necessarily mean there isn't anything. I'm just not an expert on it.
Let's go back to our first topic. So you said offshore in US is a little bit more complicated than onshore, right? Why is that?
Yes, I should have come back to that point. Thank you. So when developing onshore in the U.S., you're mostly just working with the local agencies. You're working with local landowners. I mean, as far as I know, it is theoretically possible to build a megawatt scale wind farm in the U.S. with 0 permits. Because like if you are working with the right landowners and you connect to the grid on private land, as long as you don't bring in any state actors in your activities, you don't really need a permit for a whole lot. That is completely different in the offshore space, because everything out there is either state or federal waters, or even out to international waters. And so you have to be working with the federal government.
Okay, sorry to interrupt, but what do you mean by no permit? Like no EIA, no nothing?
Yeah. If you don't bring in any state actor, you don't need an EIA to build a wind farm.
Okay.
Yeah. So many developers do try to stay just on private land. Now, I'm saying it's theoretically possible that you could build a wind farm without any permits. I don't personally know of any that have been done that way. You'll still need, especially things like road permits for actually transporting the turbines. And you generally need permits for if you need to cross any land to deliver the electricity. But yeah, as long as you stay away from state lands, state or federal lands, then you don't actually need to do, well, this goes back to the complexity of working on the county level, that some require it, some don't, many don't. So yeah, what is required in terms of permits and assessments, can change county to county.
Okay.
Yep.
Go back to offshore.
Offshore,
Yeah.
right. So offshore, we're working in state and federal waters. So most of that is happening, all of that, I think, is happening through the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, who are leasing these development areas that they have kind of decided that should be dedicated for wind energy development. And something like $4 billion in leases have already been signed, and they're in the middle of this long process to sign these areas. That's been going on for, I don't know, a couple years, and I think it's supposed to finish by 2025. So, yeah, there is deep involvement from the federal government, and the state governments that will be taking on the electricity are also generally pushing pretty hard for this. And because the states have fairly strict control over the large utilities in their areas, that they can push those utilities to either get involved in the development or just to purchase the electricity when those projects are developed.
Okay. Next question. How have changes in U.S. wind energy policies and regulations, such as tax incentives and renewable energy targets, influenced the competitiveness of the U.S. wind industry in global markets, including Europe?
Okay. Again, I don't know if I can speak to the specific impacts here on Europe, but I can point to definitely the production tax credit has just been the story of wind energy in the U.S. for its entire lifetime, and moving forward with this transition to a pretty much flat production or investment tax credit, I can see that having a significant impact on the growth of the wind energy industry. And one thing that I think really rubbed Europe the wrong way with the passing of the Inflation Reduction Act was this very generous extension of the production tax credit that will go up to something around $30 a megawatt hour. That number itself is a little bit hard to calculate. I have seen various different numbers, and it's like adjusted for inflation based on the original production tax credit of 1992. And anyway, slightly complicated, something around $30 per megawatt hour that wind energy owners can collect when generating. And that tax credit will go on basically indefinitely. Looking at LCOE trends and power purchase agreement trends in the US, I mean, PPAs are now usually below $30 a megawatt hour already, thanks to subsidies, but even the LCOE on those projects, I mean, you look at really easy projects in really windy places like Texas, you could have an LCOE down around $10, $15 a megawatt hour. Like, it is not unthinkable that a developer could sign a contract for basically zero and just give away the electricity and make a profit from the subsidies, which, it is hard to compete in the whole green hydrogen field when you're competing with free electricity. And not only that, but the Inflation Reduction Act also has subsidies for producing green hydrogen itself. So that could be a major influence on the development of a green hydrogen economy.
Okay, it was related to my last question. What are the current trends and topics that are gaining traction in the wind industry in the US? So hydrogen, maybe?
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely talk about hydrogen, and especially with the new subsidies, that could be a very lucrative industry to get into, at least something very interesting for many companies. There was a lot of talk when I was working with Invenergy about incorporating storage with wind energy, because the grid expansion just can't keep up. Maybe managing that variability with some form of storage. It's not really a big thing with wind. For solar, it's basically standard nowadays. If you're building a new solar farm, you're also building some kind of battery bank to support it. But yeah, So yeah, as far as trends, moving offshore is definitely really interesting. Onshore is still definitely the bigger player, but a lot of companies are getting really interested in the offshore space, which, that remains to be seen on how well that's going to work out. There are a lot of big players who are dumping a lot of money into this, but like, is it going to be lucrative? That, if we look at the levelized cost of energy of what it costs to build offshore in the U.S., and we have to consider that most U.S. waters where you can actually build are deeper than what you can do in Europe. Like it's not like the North Sea, where you have these nice sandy bottoms. So they're going to be more expensive. In many places, you're going to be looking at floating foundations, and if electricity prices stay where they are in 2022, maybe that's doable, especially with the Inflation Reduction Act subsidies, the investment tax credit for offshore wind. If you play your cards right and you qualify for some of the bonuses, like Uncle Sam could be underwriting half of the project cost. That could make it worth it. But if electricity prices go back down to where they were in 2019, and like, let's be honest, we kind of hope they will, that is really hard to compete. That it's a very competitive market, and electricity in the U.S. on adjusted for inflation has been pretty steady in price for quite a while, and pretty consistently cheaper than what Europeans are paying for electricity. So yeah, there are definitely some challenges, but certainly some opportunities as well.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you for this interesting topic. And do you have any words with prospective students?
Any words for prospective students?
Prospective students who are thinking about actually coming to this island and study this program.
Indeed. So our prospective students, yes, the wind industry is a great place to be. It is expanding rapidly. Even here in Europe, it is definitely healthy. And I was talking to a former graduate. I think he was in the year before me, not too long ago, and he was mentioning that if I have any interest in moving to Boston or New York, they've got lots of openings. I didn't really have an interest in moving to Boston or New York, but they need help. And yeah, all of this expansion that I've just been talking about means new job opportunities. And I think, as I hinted at in my background as well, that my last couple jobs have been thanks to my connections through this department, through my classmates. And so having this community and having these connections can be super valuable. As far as living in Visby, I mean, how often do you get to live in a World Heritage Site? It's pretty special.
Yeah. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.